Alright, hey, what's up? Welcome back to Archihacks. And in today's video, I'll walk you through creating Big Diagram. Diagram has become an integral part of architectural practice because they're so good at explaining all the concepts for your buildings. And now, well-known company Big has made a name for itself for using this style. In this tutorial, we'll be using Rhino and Illustrator to achieve this effect. Full disclaimer though, this tutorial is inspired by OGraphics, where he uses SketchUp and Photoshop to achieve the same effect. So make sure to check him out if you're a SketchUp user. Otherwise, let's get right into it. Alright, we're currently in Rhino. I've downloaded a segment of New York from this website called CADmapper. I've cleaned the file up a little bit, and if you want to download this exact file, you can download it from the link below. So I've gathered all the 3D models from CADmapper and put them into one context model. And for our actual proposal, I'm going to create a new group called steps. And for each layer, I'm going to be modeling each step of the design process. So for number one, it's just going to be site, let's say. I'm going to go ahead and lock our context so that we don't change anything. Okay, once that's complete, I'm going to use rectangle tool to outline our site. So I'll go ahead and create something like this. And then scale this down in this area, in this axis, to make sure that our site is properly sized. Okay, once that is complete, I'll create a new layer for our second step, where we're going to be creating generic massing. So I'll create something that's similar to our neighboring building. So I'll just go ahead and create something like this. And then make it same height as that one. And I'll actually use Scale 2D to offset our building slightly from the edge of our context. So it looks a bit more realistic. And then we'll do the same thing for another tower at the back over there. Okay, seems pretty good. So let's say this is like what the zoning allows us to do. And we want to make it a little bit better than this one. So we're going to create a third step. We're going to right click on the layer and choose duplicate layer and objects. And third step is where we're going to be rearranging the volumes. So I'll name it volumes. And make sure to turn off the second layer so that there's no overlapping selection. And then once that's done, we're going to make the first tower a little bit shorter. And for the tower at the back, we're going to make it a little bit more narrow. But instead, let's make it a little bit taller. So that was our move for the third step. And last but not least, to give it an iconic look, we're going to add a twist. Let's duplicate the layer and objects again and name it twist. Likewise, I'm going to turn off the third layer. And this time, I'm going to hold down Control-Shift and click on one of the faces of the building. And then we'll use the blue gumball to rotate the faces. By the way, this project is inspired by Coconut Grove project by Big. I was heavily inspired by this project when I was just starting out, and I just wanted to recreate that here. Now we need to create some arrows to help explaining all the gestures that we're making. So for the first one, I'm going to create a sublayer and name it arrow. And we'll make this layer red. Now, what we're going to show in this diagram is the issue with the building arrangement right now, where the first building is blocking the building at the back. So let's create a arrow to describe that. We'll go into our plan view and start drawing a little bit. We'll take I like to use interpolated curve because this allows you to draw out exact shape that you want to make. And with that selected, I'm going to start drawing a winding curve that kind of shows, that can be used to express blocked view. So once that is done, I'm going to type in offset to create an offset from our curve. And I'm going to use both sides option turned on. And let's reduce our distance to say 2.5. Of course, you have to make sure to choose the settings that works for you. And now make sure the cap is flat instead of none. Okay, once that is done and delete the original one, we're left with this winding curve. I'm going to create an arrowhead by using rectangle, create a square, and with a polyline, I'll just cut this in half and trim it. And then we can use move tool to rotate it around and start shaping our arrow so that it looks pretty good. I'm using various commands such as scale and trim to kind of transform our arrow. Yep, once everything is complete, I'm going to join all the curves into one single curve and then go back to our view to arrange it. So I'll put it in this arrangement. I'll bring it up a little bit. And I'll actually make it a little bit bigger as well. Okay, that looks pretty good. And I'll actually flip this over so that the arrow points directly at the building in front of us. All right, so to kind of preview what we're going to get, we can use a planar surface to fill in our arrow. But for our purpose, we're actually going to leave it blank. I'll show you why in a bit. Once that is done, we can move on to the third step. Likewise, we're going to create a sublayer called arrow, make it red. And so for this one, I'm going to create a straight arrow. And we'll do that by using the same technique. Use a rectangle to create the body of the arrow, and use a combination of polyline and square to create the arrowhead. Okay, and then I'll trim the intersection to clear that out and join it. Let's scale this one down a little bit and move it to the appropriate places. I'll move it to here. And then I'll rotate it in, and you rotate it in this axis to orient the arrow in a certain way. And then I'll place it in the right places. Copy that over. All right, that looks pretty good. So now what I'm going to do actually is to rotate this one because it's actually in a wrong orientation. We've made this building a little shorter, right? And then what I'd like to do is to kind of like express our gestures using the arrows. So for compressive move, I like to like make the arrow slightly wide. And for gestures where pulling stuff, I like to make the arrows a little bit narrow and long. Okay, that looks pretty good. We've also made the buildings narrow in this dimension, so we'll also create arrows for that. One more thing that I want to do in this step is that I want to add view arrows. And for the view arrows, I'm going to create a new sublayer and give it a different color so we can distinguish them a little bit. And choose copy objects to layer. And what this does is it creates a same instance in the different layer while keeping the old ones still intact. So I'm just going to go ahead and place this in the right place. Place our arrow in the second building where we just provided a new view as a result of extending the building in the back and compressing the building in the front. Okay, I'm just going to make sure that this arrow is not intersecting with the building. And let's see everything together. Okay. I think it's possible that this arrow is a little too close, so I'm going to redistribute them a little bit. Move it down. Okay. Yeah, I'll keep it like that for now. And let's move on to our final gesture where we're giving this iconic twist. I'll create another arrow layer. And this time I'm actually going to duplicate this layer, duplicate layer in objects, and bring it to drag and drop into this fourth step to make a copy in this layer group. Once we turn it on, as you can see, we have the same arrow that we made earlier. Now, let's go ahead and edit this so that we are showing how the views have rotated. I'm using combination of move command as well as rotate to place the arrow in the correct locations. For the second arrow, I kind of want it to be on this side. And then put it slightly off from the building. And I'll take these two and simply copy this over into our lower building. And for this one, we'll have to bring this down. Just like that. Okay. Looks good. All right, I'm gonna move on to our twist arrow. I'll make this layer red as usual. And go to plan and draw some rotating arrow. For this, I'm gonna use the command called circle. And I'll use offset again. And I'll offset twice to maintain same arrow thickness. And quickly create a arrowhead for this as well. One neat trick that I like to use is when you're moving to a point that is exactly in between 2 points, you can use the command called between. And once you do that, you can choose 2 points, and Rhino will place your initial point in the middle of the 2. Okay, once that is done, I'm going to use trim to get rid of unnecessary curves, and then we'll be left with this rotating curve. Okay, that looks pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and place this on top of the building. Okay, looks good. Now just move it forward just a little bit. Actually, yeah, I'll leave it right there. And then I'll make a copy and place it right on the second building. I'll try to center that a little bit. Oh, okay. Oh yeah, it's way high up in the air, so I'm gonna... Now with everything turned on, this is how it looks. And we are ready to make this into a 2D line work. So in order to do so, I'm gonna go into properties and make sure our projection is parallel. You could actually use perspective if you wanted, but for this instance, we'll use parallel. And I have a view saved already, so I'll just use that. And once everything is set up in place, I'm going to capture them one at a time using make2d command. So when you're making 2D, I'll use the current view that we're looking at. Projection will be by view, and we'll maintain source layers. And you can keep these off, and we'll make sure to turn on scene silhouette because this gives us the nice outline. And then viewport rectangle, that will be useful in creating our artboards later. And we can group output if you wanted, and this won't be too necessary. Actually, we'll call this all caps diagram because we have a convention going on. And once you say OK, you'll see that in plan view, you have a line version of the diagram that we just made. We'll repeat this process for the other steps as well. Turn off the fourth step and use make2d. And once that comes out, we'll place it right next to each other so that we can export them and organize them slightly easily. We'll go to our second step, make2d. Last but not least, step 1. Done. All right, once that is complete, we can export these into Illustrator. We'll type in the command export and choose Illustrator as our export file format. And we'll save it as diagram outline. When the option pops up, we'll just use snapshot of the current view and say OK. All right, before we switch over to Illustrator, we have to export our base model. So for that, we'll come back to our original perspective, go over to V-Ray settings and make these changes. We'll turn off progressive and use V-Ray denoiser and turn on material override to make everything a single color. And then we'll switch over to lighting, where we're going to turn on Rhino Document Sun and reduce the brightness to 0.1, make the size. If you increase this value, it actually makes your shadow a lot more soft. And for color mode, we'll use override so that everything stays black and white. Lastly, I'll make sure our render output is high resolution. And then let's try how that looks. Okay, once the rendering is complete, I'll actually go over and use color correction. So if you click on this little icon in the bottom left corner, it'll bring up this little pane. And here you can make some quick adjustments to your images so that you don't have to go all the way to Photoshop. So for our purpose, I'll reduce the exposure just a little bit. Actually, I'll make the highlight burn 0.5 and increase the exposure just so that the brightest part is pure white. I'm going to go ahead and use levels adjustments. Make sure to turn the check mark on so that the editing is enabled. And I'll take the bottom right corner pin here and then bring it up. So this curves move will leave the bright parts the way they are, but take the dark sides and then bring them just a little bit more bright. Once that looks good, we are ready to save this. I'll name this render output and save it. And now we are ready to head over to Illustrator. Okay, I've just opened up our Illustrator file that we have just exported, and here's our result. So as you can see, our diagram's a little small, so I will make this a little bigger. I'll right-click, transform, scale it, and we'll scale this up so that 1-point line is a good amount of thickness. So right now, it still looks a little bit too thick, so I'm gonna make it 600% and say okay. All right, that looks pretty good. And we'll take all these frames and remove and invert the black and white. Now we can use these frames to create new artboards. If you simply click on these black boxes, Illustrator will create new artboards for you that fits just. And we can delete the original artboard that we started with. Once that is complete, we can actually completely get rid of this whole layer. There we go. And now we have evenly sized artboards that are right next to each other. And our diagram stays exactly in the same place. Now, first thing I want to do is I want to import our image. So I'll navigate to our folder and drag and drop our image onto our canvas. I'll place this on a new layer called background. And by dragging this little box over to the other layer, we can move image between the layer. I'll place this right at the bottom and start scaling it so that it fits perfectly with our diagram. So by default, if you make the image fit perfectly into the frame, it should, and center it, it should align with the line work. To test it, we'll try pasting that into other panels. And a quick tip for doing that is by cutting this original object out and using Ctrl-Alt-Shift-V, we can place the same image in every panel, just like that. All right, seems like it's aligning pretty well. So I'll lock that layer and go over and start merging some of our layers. So there's a lot of commonality between all the common line weights between all the layers. So I can start editing them just a little bit. So for example, if you look closely in the layer names, these actually follow the conventions that we've set out in Rhino. And for these ones, I'm going to take all the layers that says Scene Silhouette, right click, and go into the little drop down option here and merge selected. And this will conveniently take all the objects in all the layers you selected and put them into one. And I'll rename this as Silhouette, actually. Okay. And for these guys, I'll place it right at the bottom. So likewise, I'm going to define all the layers that end with arrow and merge it and name it arrow. And for the views, I'll merge them as well. And name it view. And all the regular layers, we can simply merge them all together and call it curves. Okay, our layer 1 doesn't actually have anything, so I'll delete it. So now all our layers are nicely organized into just 5. And now what's really convenient about this is that you can apply changes throughout all the diagrams. So for arrow layer, I'll just click on the blank space on the right and invert the foreground and background color to give all the arrows the color that we wanted. And same goes for view, we'll simply invert that. And for curves, we can actually just leave it the way it is. And for silhouettes, we will use default color where we have white fill and black outline. One thing I noticed is that the silhouette layer is actually not joined together, so we'll have to join them manually. In order to do so, I'm gonna lock all the other layers and just step by step, select all the outlines in one diagram, right click and join, and repeat this process. Oh, when they're separate maskings, make sure to select them individually so that there's no funny lines going across from each other. Okay, looks good. Repeat that process. All right, there we go. Now we'll take all the silhouette objects and give it a slightly thicker line weight. All right, she looks a little too thick, so all right, I'll reduce that to 2. And we'll take our normal curves layer and reduce that to, let's say, 0.75. All right, yeah, I like that. It's pretty good. And actually, just for the first diagram, because it looks a little too boring, I'm gonna give it a special treatment. Let's break this out and add a red outline. Increase the curved stroke size a little bit. And let's add some dashed line to it. And another cool trick is that if you want to give it a different fill opacity, such as, so for example, I want the outline to be 100% opacity, but not the fill color, we can open up the Appearance tab, which is available in Windows Appearance, and drop down into Fill and change the opacity to your desired amount. I think I'm going to go with 30%. And there we go. Now we have all 4 steps ready to go. One last thing I might want to do is to add green for the park that's in front of our site. So I'll go ahead and create a new layer and say this is park. And using a pen tool and draw in a triangular area. Okay. And I'll make it so that our foreground color is kind of nice green and lower the opacity to say about 50%. Using the same paste technique, we'll paste it into all of our drawings. There we go. Okay. I think the grass is looking a little bit too dark, so I'm actually going to lower the opacity to say about 30%. And yeah, I think that looks pretty good. I'll lock that back. And one last handy tip is that you can rename all your artboards so that your file gets renamed automatically. So we can say this is step 1. Step 2. If you simply double click on the name, it'll allow you to rename each artboard. All right, let's start exporting into JPEG images. You can go into File, Export, Export for Screen. And go into the Artboard tab, choose All, and find the directory that you want to save to. I'll use the settings above and start exporting. And I'll go over to another software such as InDesign to finalize our design. So in here, I've taken some images from Dig's website and made a quick panel out of it. As you can see, it fits in perfectly with the proposal. And there we go, you've just created competition-style, high-quality diagrams. Let me know if you guys liked it, and also let me know if you guys have any suggestions for future contents. As always, it's been Archihacks, and I'll see you guys next time.